Professor Mary Beer, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's an absolute honor to have you on.
And it's a pleasure for me too. So thank you, Ro.
Um, I wanted to have a conversation with you, or for you to give us a history lesson about what's happening, not just in Afghanistan to women, but around the world. You know, we're regressing on many fronts, but in particular, when it comes to Afghanistan, as Meryl Streep put it in the Hollywood star Meryl Streep put it in a recent speech, that a woman or a girl has less rights, or a cat has more rights in Afghanistan than women do, or girls do. A bird has more rights than girls and women in Afghanistan. A bird may sing, but a woman can't. A cat may roam free, a woman can't. But I don't know how appropriate this metaphors are. But I just wanted to ask you where this whole idea of women's place has to be somewhere oppressed and suppressed.
Mm. Yeah. I mean, my perspective on this is, wholly historical. That's what I do. I
Yes.
do the history of it. Um, and I suppose I'd put it like this, really, that there is one strand of conservative thought which would suggest that some of the oppression of women that you see across the world is sort of natural. That in the division of the sexes, um, what somehow happened was that women got the subservient role and men got the roles of power. Now, I think there is nothing natural about this whatsoever. But I do think that the history of, well, anything that veers from sort of everyday sexism to outright misogyny is is as old as we can trace it in world history, or certainly as old as I can trace it. Right? And it's very clear, and I obviously know most about the world of the ancient Greeks and Romans, but I know a bit about other things, is that you repeatedly see uh, male power asserted by control over women's activities and women's bodies and women's clothing and whatsoever. And that is that is a function almost wherever I can think of, right? And it's a function in 21st century Britain. That I mean, although at a rather more kind of genial level, um, but there is still this kind of sense that what women wear should be policed by the the male dominated state, and we all know the examples of judges telling rape victims they shouldn't have been wearing short skirts. Now, that is one part of the same phenomenon, I
Mm.
think. Um, but I know best, as I say, I know best ancient Greece and Rome. And there you'll find, I think, particularly in ancient Athens, you find something much more hardline than people tend to imagine, at least among elite women. It's very hard to know what happened in classical Athens to the non-elite. But we tend to have a rather romantic glow about fifth century Athens as the time of um, philosophy and drama.
Socrates corrupting the youth.
That's right. It goes with a very we're taught to admire it. Um, it's very different if you look at what happens to the elite women in that town. Now, as far as we can see, they were rigorously policed. They were more or less confined to the home and to the women's quarters in the home. Their clothing was policed, and they may well, this is somewhat uncertain, the evidence is a bit unclear, um, they may well have been veiled. Now, that conflicts rather with our free libertarian view of ancient Athens. But if you think of some of those big institutions that we're so kind of proud of in some ways as the inheritors of, the Athenian tragic theatre, for example, um, it is almost certain, again, often quite hard to pin down this absolutely, but it's almost certain that no women were present at the theatre. So, we think of citizenly occasions. We think of the assembly. Well, no women have any political rights. No women have the vote. But they can't even sit in the theatre of Dionysus watching tragedy.
Mm.
And there are some indications that their movement outside was very restricted outside the home. I mean, there's an interesting law speech from the early fourth century, for example, where it's a kind of a murder and adultery speech. But interestingly, it says the only way that the wife met was spotted by the person who's alleged to be the adulterer was because she went to a funeral. I mean, so there are very limited times in which women appear at the elite level. And we're not
Mm.
talking female slaves or the female poor here. That they're actually allowed out, and I think it's always very interesting because in a strange way, you see these restrictions much more clearly amongst the elite. We're used to think of restrictions probably falling heaviest on those without means and resources. But in the ancient world, the women who were most restricted were the women whose husbands could afford to restrict them. We don't, this is not about the peasant farmers or whatever.
Mm.
And I do think it's extremely interesting because, I mean, I mentioned, look, women can't go to the theatre. Now, of course, the theatre is one place where we see on stage, originally all played by male actors. Of course, there were no
Yeah,
women,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
no women actors in the theatre. We see what looks like powerful women on stage. We see Medea, the witch from the Black Sea, who is dumped by her slime bag husband Jason and then, kills her children in revenge. We see Clytemnestra, the wife of Agamemnon, who takes vengeance on her husband brutally when after he's sacrificed, literally put to death, their daughter. And people, I think, often look at that and they think, gosh, so there must be some sort of real life female power going on here.
Mm.
Well, I think absolutely not is probably the answer to that. I think that what you find is that as often and I don't know how it would work now in, say, Afghanistan, but in often, in my experience, in those very repressive regimes, actually it causes a cultural problem. That the repression of women isn't easy to do. I mean, you can enforce it, but you might go think of a different case. You might think of apartheid in South Africa, that actually there was effective and brutal exploitation and suppression of the black population,
Yeah.
but it wasn't done without cultural anxiety. Right? I think people by and large, uh, you know, there's a pushback. There's always a pushback,
Yeah.
and what you see in the Athenian theatre, I think, is um, uh, the the idea that the male population, the male authors, the male actors, the male audience, in a sense, are partly justifying
Mm.
their oppression and control of women by showing on stage actually these women who really step out of line. You don't want to be married to Clytemnestra. She murders her husband. So there's always this. I think that the restriction of women's rights, the oppression of women, is almost always accompanied by a cultural tradition which justifies that, by a kind of fear of women, by a sense that women, if you don't do this, women will be disordered. And the whole of Greek mythology is in some ways full of the fear of women getting the upper hand. Look at the stories of the mythical warrior race of Amazons, women only race of warriors who kind of live somewhere on the margins of the Greek world. Again, we often look at that and we think, um, uh, oh, look, there must be some kind of idea that women could have power.
Hmm.
It's much more likely that this is part and parcel of the same phenomenon that women have to be controlled. And you see that by inventing women out of control and how terrible that is. And what will happen, what will happen to the world if the women got any power? Well,
Yeah.
the women are always bound to mess up. And and so these kind of things that it's not just, I think, or I've come to see this, it's not just um a an attempt to control women, to control women's bodies, etc., which it is. But it's part and parcel of a whole version of a male world, which is actually also frightened of women,
Yeah.
um, needs to justify its control of women. So all this goes together into a hugely complicated historical and cultural amalgam, I think.
Yeah. So, it's very interesting and, incredibly enlightened that you mentioned the word fear and custom. The Taliban, they justify it on two strands, which is one is, it's mandated by religion,
Uh,
and also it is in accordance with our traditional values.
yeah, yeah,
That is up for debate. So, for example, I've had guests on this podcast and others have said as well, the Taliban's interpretation of Islam is up for debate,
yeah,
but also because of them being a Pashtun movement, they take their code of behavior
yeah,
from
yeah,
their, tribal
yes,
practice and
yeah.
values. The fear comes from the belief of women's corrupting influence.
Yeah, well, you would find that also in the ancient world. You could flip here to ancient Rome, for example, and you could look at the stories of Roman emperors and Roman emperors' wives, right?
Hmm.
And you see there in glorious, horrible Technicolor, the idea that the corrupt woman, the woman who's sexually available, who quotes, cheats on her husband, is a danger to the whole social and political order. And that goes back in some ways, but I think not only, to the sense of, one of patriarchy's most building block fears, which is that the man's son will not be the son of will not be the man's son.
Yeah.
That one of the reasons for policing the behavior of women is that you need to control their sexuality. You have a very strongly um, male line of succession, both in terms of property and in terms of bloodline and inheritance. And women are always the weak link in that
Hmm.
because you can always know who the mother is. But until recent developments in DNA, you couldn't know who the father was. So, one of the basic tricks, and I'm using that slightly in inverted commas, one of the basic tricks of patriarchy is to control married women to ensure that they did not pollute or corrupt the bloodline. Now, I think that's only one
Hmm.
factor. I think it's one factor which is shared across many cultures, and it's now actually probably uh, we are in a kind of odd world in which that is no longer an issue. If you want to know who someone's dad is, you do a DNA test, right? Until the last, what, 20, 30 years, those were anxieties that the 20th century Britain had. I mean, look at the discussions around the children of Second World War soldiers
Hmm.
and the anxiety that that the father who'd been away fighting and had come back for one weekend was not actually the father. And it's one of the biggest worries. Patriarchy is a very anxious system, and that's one of its biggest anxieties. Now, you mentioned religion, and I think that um, religion, in my view, and I don't know enough about the history of Islam to know if this is can be applied more generally than my own areas, but religion, in what I'm familiar with, tends to legitimate. It tends to be a strong moral, higher order legitimation of the patriarchal
A
system.
sort of instrument.
It doesn't cause it. It's not the fountainhead of it. And you see that in you see the anxiety about women's roles, and again big question marks about women's power in the pantheon of Greek and Roman pagan deities.
Yeah.
Now, we we often think because we're uh, we're used to. I mean, I don't know. I think kids still do. You learn at school tables of Greek gods when you're in primary school. Who were the Greek gods? Well, there was Juno or Hera, she was queen of the gods, and Athena, she was the goddess of wisdom. And you come away. We have made that somehow into a kind of sense of um, a, a, a kind of, well, we provide powerful women within that pantheon, right? Well, I often think that the goddess Athena, or Minerva as she was called in Rome, is a real interesting example of how complicated divine power is in understanding female power or lack of it. And I think that you say, oh look, Athena's the goddess of wisdom. She's powerful. She's a military goddess too. She's when you see her, she's represented with a spear and a helmet and all this. Um, and there is a version there, we like to think, of presenting a powerful woman. In fact, what it's saying is much more Athena is a complete freak.
Hmm.
One thing you cannot ever have. The idea of dressing a woman up in a helmet is as kind of destabilizing for ancient viewers as seeing a toddler with a Kalashnikov is
Yeah.
um, for us. And you find everywhere you look, um, ancient pagan religion is also in some way legitimizing
Yeah.
um, the the awkward position of women. Aphrodite. Well, isn't she gorgeous? The goddess of love. Yeah, but so dangerous. You don't want to get too close to Aphrodite because look what she might do. She might make you. She might undermine your power by the power of passion, right? And you got to be careful. And every which way you go, scratch the surface of Greco-Roman culture,
Hmm.
religion, and the rest. You find this sense of worry, anxiety, uncertainty, fear, and control.
Yeah.
And I think that it's not that every other country in the world, every other culture is the same as that.
Yeah.
Of course, it isn't. There are particular differences. There are micro differences. Um, there are different reasons within different cultures for doing different things. But some of that, the basic building blocks of that, are found in almost every misogynistic culture.
The Taliban's justification of their, for example, some of their rules, as a stranger they may sound in 2025, is, the click of a woman's footsteps will push a man to deviate to the wrong path,
Yes,
or the sound of her voice in public will do the same thing. So
yes,
it's all about, the sexual corrupting effect
yes,
of a woman or a girl
yes,
on men.
yes,
But
that's right.
doesn't he actually? in a sense or in a very open way, demonstrate the men's own weakness in their own self-control or self-belief.
Yes, yes, and so they have to do an enormous amount of cultural hard labor to justify the position. I mean, I think that the reason that misogyny is so on the map, on the cultural map, in many cultures, not not just those I'm familiar with, is because it takes a lot of justification. You have to shout very loud
Hmm.
to make it seem natural. I mean, the what most misogynistic cultures try to do, I think, is to make this cultural suppression of women seem natural,
Hmm.
seem obvious, seem the only way, like to give no alternative to it. And it does that by they do that by extraordinary um, and implausible um, claims,
Hmm.
um, which, in a sense, take all the mess and all the anxieties of the world and try to
Hmm.
make them seem undeniably true, right?
Yeah.
And that's why religion, I think, is often, is often part and parcel of that. Not because the religion causes it,
Hmm.
but because the religion is engaged in naturalizing the social order.
So, in a sense, religion is subservient to the pre-existing desire of men to control women.
Yeah, no, you could get many on your podcast who would disagree violently, Ro, I think, with that claim.
Yeah.
But I think there are, in some ways, that's a line that's worth exploring. That,
Okay.
I mean, uh, you could do this with, early Christianity, and I would have a very good argument um, with a Christian scholar of early Christianity who would disagree violently. But I think there is a sense that one of the jobs religion does, and it's not the only job, and to believers it isn't. It tends to get hidden,
Hmm.
but it naturalizes the order of the world.
When you look at the this amazing goddesses, amazing ancient figurines, you know, they're incredibly beautiful. They've kind of captured the I suppose I don't know if it's the right way for me to say the objectivity of a woman's beauty, right?
Yeah.
But on the flip side of it, in the modern day, women are being pushed into you got to be hidden. We can't allow you to be seen. For example, a Taliban figure going on the national television to say, well, women really don't need both eyes to be seen on public, so they can
That's
perfectly see with one eye as well. It's not Islamic for women to actually have both eyes uncovered. So you can use just one eye as well. So it's kind of the complete erasure of
yeah.
women's, I suppose, physical embodiment as well.
Yeah, I mean, and those two sides often go together, and I think they do in antiquity. The woman is beautiful and is marvelous, but is also corrupting and dangerous. And there are plenty of both mythical and historical figures that you would see became very much the focus of that kind of talk in antiquity. Cleopatra.
Yeah.
You know, Cleopatra is absolutely, um, she's irresistible. She's literally irresistible. Queen, an Eastern queen, Egyptian queen. And yet she destroys the guys. Mark Antony is destroyed by Cleopatra. And that's just one tiny example of that constant ambivalence, which I think, you still see in anywhere you look,
Mm.
that there is the idea of women's danger and women's irresistibility are joined at the hip. And of course, you say like you do, well, sorry guys, You better learn to resist, hadn't you? Right? You know, this is not my fault. Sorry you know, if I'm irresistible, wasn't anything to do with me. It's to do with you, and you should learn a bit more self-control. Um, but cultures throughout history have usually blamed the woman for that. You blame the woman for the fact that you cannot resist her. And that's certainly, one um, one strand of Greco-Roman thought. And I think it's not the only strand, and it can be too gloomy because if you go back to Greece and Rome, there are also um, stories that go hand in hand with that of desire and passion, which is celebrated,
Hmm.
right? But it never quite avoids the issue that just under the surface, women are dangerous.
In the Eastern culture, there's this idea, at least in Afghanistan, that region, there's this idea called namus, which roughly, my translation is honor. That's the idea of the honor killing come from. So the violation of women is the violation of honor,
Yeah,
and that the country itself has become a feminine thing. Like your homeland is your mother.
yeah.
Anyone who attacks it is violating your honor, dishonoring your women. So
Yeah.
where does that come from?
I think that um, I'm not sure you can do an easy genealogy, but
Yeah.
another side to what I've been talking about would be the sense that the status of the man or the male community is linked to the behavior of the women. We know this. There's the old figure that you can find in, you know, British kind of Renaissance and later literature, the cuckold.
Mhm.
What do you think of the man whose wife is having an affair with his best mate? You know, now that has become, I think, a bit weakened in British popular humour, but it goes back to the idea that man's status then is seen to depend on the extent to which he controls his female dependents. That and their behavior, and this is very true um, in many of the stories about the Roman imperial court and um, Roman the female relatives of the Roman
Mhm.
emperor, is that they have to be controlled because their behavior um, determines and defines his power. So if you have a wife who is, in terms of the old Emperor Claudius, it's a very interesting question that fits rather well with your view. I mean, Claudius is elderly, he's supposedly rather frail. He's not a glorious, wonderful, sexy, whatever
Mhm.
Roman man. Um, and of course, it's his wives, because he has several, whose sexual behavior is put under the microscope. Because the fact that his wife Messalina will go out at night, so it was said, I'm sure this isn't true. Most of these stories are not true. Um, and sleep with as many people as she can throughout the
Mhm.
streets of Rome. That's not really a story about Messalina. It's a story about the powerlessness of her husband.
Mhm.
It's a kind of very neat, small example of what you're talking about in terms of, honor, in terms of male power, writ rather larger in terms of the political community, not just the individual.
Mhm. But there's this, when you ask these these men as to, to hold them accountable for what they do, the answer usually is, well, we respect women. Women are our mothers. Women are our sisters. Women are our daughters. And some of them say, women are our wives. So what would you go back to them like?
Well, I think you know, you have to unpick all this, and it's very, very hard. Nobody in the ancient world unpicked it. It's very easy to do it from a distance, where, and the ancient world that I work on is a safe space where you can explore those difficulties. It's, it is very, very hard um, to to expose to people who are within that system where its fault lines are.
Mm.
It's just because uh, because as you know we were saying, an awful lot of cultural or religious or historical debate and the zeitgeist or
Yeah,
whatever
yeah, yeah.
um is devoted to making their views seem reasonable, and not just reasonable, because that kind of would imply that there was an alternative. It'd be the only way you can see the world.
Mm.
And I think it is. I think the unpicking is is almost. I mean, it's a lifetime's work.
And so on money fronts, Afghanistan is not unique, but it is an extreme example.
Yeah,
But we as societies, as communities of people around the world, we've been regressing. And it seems there's a sense of an obliviousness towards what's going on, and why that is.
I think these things go up and down,
Mm.
and I think it's important to have um, your eye open for regression. I mean, you can look at what's happening in the United States about um, women's reproductive rights, where it's perfectly legitimate, I think, to say there is, you know, the progress has been reversed. I suspect these things are all constantly in flux. And what I would like to know, and I don't have an answer to this, is how you ensure the direction of travel is in it. I'm trying to choose my words carefully because um, there's a danger, I think, here of being kind of fantastically um, self-righteous and overconfident in one's own views, right?
Mm, mm, mm.
So I want to say I want the direction of travel to be in the towards a path of the right. You
Yeah,
know, um, I think what I should say is I want the direction of travel to be towards looking out for the fairness and equality of treatment of the whole of the human race.
yeah,
That's men as well as women. I do. I think that I think it's right to be alarmed
yeah, yeah, yeah,
about when things about the seeming problems there are now, and I think they're more than seeming. But I think if you were to take 1,000 year trajectory, you find ups and downs. It would be interesting to think harder, and I've not thought harder about what causes
yeah,
those micro changes. What and you would suggest that it was political tension and more. The more the male power and masculinity seems under threat,
yeah,
the more pressure there is
yeah.
to control the women. That seems like a kind of fairly obvious axiom. Whether it's a true axiom, I don't know.
I'm very conscious of the time. If you were to give us a story, a short story about how, a kind of that would link the ancient world to the modern one, but also a message to women and girls in Afghanistan as to where could they get a source of hope.
Greek mythology isn't a great place for getting a source of hope, and um, most of the stories that have some kind of um, broadly speaking, feminist point are also pretty destructive of the women involved.
Hmm.
I mean, and there's one I think about. Well, now this is difficult from the ancient world perspective because where you find women's voices being heard most,
Hmm.
um, and where you think, right, I'm now hearing um, the point of view of a woman. A woman, even if voiced by a male writer or whatever, is speaking. They tend to be in in the context of most appalling sadistic crimes. I mean, female Christian martyrs speak out, but only when they're about to be killed, right?
Yeah.
Um, and you find the bravery of women is is most clearly expressed uh, when they are in positions of most danger and most violence. I mean, there is the extraordinary story of the rape of Lucretia in from early Roman history, when I quotes as Romans, where a respectable married woman is is raped by the appallingly corrupt nephew of the king or son of the king. I can't remember which. Um, he threatens Lucretia. Uh, he says that unless you let me do what I want to do, I will kill you and I will kill your slave and I will put them, I will lay your bodies out together. And
Mm.
it will look as if you were found in adultery, kind of
Yeah, 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 yeah.
actually out, using that kind of image of adultery back on the woman herself. So Lucretia gives in. Then what does she do? She outs it. She goes to her servants. She says, "Get my husband, who's away, get my father here." And she tells them exactly what happened. She doesn't conceal, she tells them exactly what happened. Sad thing is, she ends up stabbing herself. And so you find these images of bravery, um, uh, one horribly
Yeah.
undermined. And even, I mean, if you want a comedy, which may be a kind of happier, so
Yes.
a wonderful comedy by Aristophanes, Lysistrata.
Yes.
Um, and, it's where, okay, it's written by a man, but it presents the women of the two warring cities, Sparta and Athens, deciding that they're fed up with the war and the men are behaving dreadfully. So they're going to bring them to their senses. It's women's power. And so they say they will not sleep with them until they make peace. Right? Now, it's often played now, and in some ways it's a nice way of playing it, as an example of women's power breaking through this rubbish.
Yes.
Right? And I wouldn't want to stop anybody playing it like that. In the actual Greek original, sadly, it's partly a joke on the women because the women, once more, in the way we've talked about, are seen as oversexed. So
Yes.
actually, it's the women who can barely manage to do this because women, as you know, always want sex all the time, right? And then, and so it's not quite like we usually play it. But even worse, when it comes to the end and the men have agreed they're going to make peace, um, they have to decide, which bits of the Greek world Athens is going to have and which bit Sparta is going to have.
Yeah.
And how do they do it? They get a naked woman to pretend to be a map of Greece and they mark out the territory on her body. So, every time you find these flickers of
Yes.
something, right, it's always undercut, actually. So I think there's no place that I can point to in my world where I want to say, look, there's a
Yes.
message for you. I
Well,
mean, I think, you can find it in other places. You can find it in Chaucer and things like this.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
There's good bits where actually I think there's the wonderful bit in Chaucer where a woman laughs at her husband and it becomes the most fantastic put down. Actually in the end, laugh at them, says Chaucer. But, I wish I had a whole load of examples up my sleeve. But I don't.
To end this, and it's an absolute honor, and I just wanted to ask, what would be Mary Beard's call for action on the gender apartheid that's going on in Afghanistan to the
I
world, to people who listen? What would be your call to action?
I think that it would be hubristic in the classical sense of that. It would be me being more confident in my own abilities than I should be to say I've got, uh, me to offer a solution,
Yeah.
I think is insulting to the women of Afghanistan. I think that what they should know, however, is that there are lots of people like me who are on their side, and we'll do anything that we can to support them, but it's their lead, right? We, it's about time that white Western women stop telling the women in the rest of the world how to behave and what to do. We should be allies, not leaders.
That's fantastic. Thank you ever so much. I thoroughly enjoyed it, learned an enormous amount. Um, Grateful, as ever grateful. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rob. Thank
Thank you.
you. See you, I
Thanks.
hope.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.